Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Against the Web, a Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right, by Michael Brooks. Narrated by Sam Seder. Chapter 1. Meet the New Right, the Intellectual Dark Web and Capital's Contradictions. Everyone is preoccupied by how the online world is shaping politics. The left and many liberals have been deeply concerned with the right's fluency on platforms ranging from YouTube to Instagram to Twitter, and their ability to use these platforms to push their messages and create an overall political narrative. With authoritarian right-wing governments holding power from the United States to Brazil and Hungary to India, the need to understand and overcome these forces is urgent. This book focuses on the intellectual dark web, IDW, a group exercise in collective self-branding that may already be by the wayside. However, the tactics, ideologies, and arguments used by this group remain relevant for understanding the broader center-right and right-wing ecosystem and the absolutely necessary changes that the left must make to tell its own more appealing and dynamic story. The IDW is a group of men that Barry Weiss introduced to the world in a 2018 New York Times profile titled Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web. According to Weiss, the IDW was a group of maverick intellectuals who, feeling locked out by a relatively new and culturally dominant, quote, political correctness, came together to speak truth to the power of the liberal consensus. According to Weiss, the group was quickly taken up by a public hungry for free thinking, and it's certainly true that the two most prominent members, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, were filling auditoriums with admiring fans. By the end of the year, when Amelia Lester called the online magazine Quillette, quote, the voice of the intellectual dark web, in Politico, everyone likely to read such an article was well familiar with the IDW. This is how Weiss introduced the IDW in her original piece. Here are some things that you will hear when you sit down to dinner with the vanguard of the intellectual dark web. There are fundamental biological differences between men and women. Free speech is under siege. Identity politics is a toxic ideology that is tearing American society apart. And we're in a dangerous place if these ideas are considered dark. Showing a stunning lack of historical awareness, and by the way, the IDW's stunning lack of historical awareness will be one of the major themes of this book, the subjects of the profile inform Weiss that, quote, a decade ago, when Donald Trump was hosting The Apprentice, none of these observations would have been considered taboo. In reality, both the groups claim to be a persecuted minority and their depiction of the left as censorious and dominant were hardly new accusations. The conservative framing of American politics around a perceived culture war dates back to at least 1951, when National Review founder William F. Buckley, who was, in that moment, both a segregationist and a vocal white supremacist, released his book, God and Man at Yale. Though the culture war specifics might not have been firmly in place in that book, they certainly were by the time conservative philosopher Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind in 1987. When the movie PCU, starring a bald Jeremy Piven, came out in 1994, 10 years before the first season of The Apprentice and a full 24 years before Barry Weiss's piece hit the New York Times, these complaints were shop-worn cliches. So is the IDW just a rebranding of old-style cultural conservatism? Not exactly, although you might be forgiven for thinking so when you notice that Ben Shapiro is an IDW member in good standing. Shapiro is a religious conservative who believes that Palestinian rights can be disregarded because, as he says in one YouTube clip, God gave Israel to the Jewish people. In the video entitled Ben Shapiro, Why Jews Vote Leftist, a young Shapiro expresses amazement and disgust that most American Jews don't share this belief. Like any good fundamentalist, Shapiro is firmly opposed to letting women control their own bodies. He invariably refers to abortion as, quote, killing babies. He regularly speaks out against, quote, open borders, gun control, socialism, and even redistributive taxation. In 2003, 2 years after a teenaged Shapiro began writing a nationally syndicated column, the conservative obsession with teen prodigies never ceases to amaze, he used it to cheer on the invasion of Iraq. Shapiro could be grouped together with Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity as naturally as he is with the IDW comrades in arms, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. It's probably Harris who genuinely does part ways with the Limbaughs and Hannitys of the world on a number of core issues, who marks the difference between the IDW and the more old-fashioned right. The Stanford and UCLA-educated neuroscientist is a warmonger and an apologist for the status quo in many ways I'll explore as the book goes on, but he has conventionally liberal views on domestic policy issues ranging from abortion to closing the gun show loophole. He supported Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and where Ben Shapiro naively believes that God himself shares his attitudes toward women and Palestinians, Harris is fiercely secular. Long before there was an intellectual dark web, Harris belonged to a group of intellectuals who collectively branded themselves the New Atheists. While many of my major intellectual influences are in fact atheists of the old-school materialist tradition who analyze religion as a cultural force determined by economics and social relations, I was always critical of the obsessive view of atheism as an innately liberating belief system that superseded the material conditions that we all live in and that shape our lives. The New Atheists, and Harris in particular, spent a lot of time obsessing over the problem that people believe, quote, bad things, even as they ignored the real-world forces that might generate those bad beliefs, and in turn adopted much of the reactionary worldview of their Christian counterparts in the Bush administration. But we will explore Harris's fixation on, quote, bad ideas later in the book. For now, it's suffice to say that his prime intellectual contribution to New Atheism was to put a scholarly sheen on the belligerent, hysterical, and ultimately imperial neoconservative foreign policy agenda that defined the American right's worldview in the Bush era. Seen from this perspective, his current chummy collaboration with Shapiro is not as surprising as it might otherwise seem. Still, this move to the IDW milieu certainly represents a step down from the New Atheist scene. Christopher Hitchens was a witty and insightful writer whose post-9/11 turn to the right was preceded by a long and honorable history on the left. Richard Dawkins is not just a schmuck on Twitter, he's also a real scientist and a gifted popularizer of evolutionary biology. Daniel Dennett was writing serious academic philosophy long before he started writing for a popular audience. Compare Hitchens, Dawkins, and Dennett to Harris's new club, which includes failed stand-up comic Dave Rubin as a charter member. In the original New York Times piece, Weiss credulously quotes Rubin when he called himself and the rest of the IDW, quote, just a crew of people trying to have the kind of important conversations that the mainstream media won't. If you watch my show, you're undoubtedly reading that quote in the Rubin voice, which should make the experience much more satisfying. Now, Rubin and I exist in the same media ecosystem, hosting YouTube shows and podcasts. In fairness, his show has a larger audience than mine, while my show is the infinitely superior program. I am the host of TMBS, The Michael Brooks Show, and the co-host of The Majority Report, which is part of the TYT, the Young Turks Network, as was Rubin's show until he dramatically left the left in 2015. My good friend and frequent collaborator, Anna Kasparian, knew Rubin during his TYT years. The way she tells it, he, quote, left the left at least as much as a cynical career move as a genuine ideological shift. I believe her. Even if you think his turn toward, quote, classical liberalism, read half-baked libertarianism, was completely sincere, though, here's what anyone who watches his show can confirm for themselves. Dave Rubin doesn't belong in the intellectual anything. He's dumb as a rock. He might as well be a rock to judge how little he bothers challenging the right-wing guests he has, quote, important conversations with on his show. He talks a lot about having high-level conversations about ideas. But in practice, he stares blankly into space while a parade of crackpots and crypto and not-so-crypto fascists make ridiculous assertions. His idea of having, quote, important conversations certainly doesn't include talking to anyone who would seriously challenge him. He's been dodging debate challenges from the Majority Report's Sam Seder for years. To get a sense of why he's so afraid of Seder, check out how he did in what was supposed to be a friendly chat with an ideological ally, the amiable and IDW-aligned Joe Rogan. On episode 1131 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Rubin rants about the evils of government regulation. He and Rogan start out by agreeing that bakers shouldn't have to make cakes for gay people's weddings, gliding over the possible civil rights implications for legislation all over the country. Rubin, as usual, gets a lot of mileage out of being a married gay man himself. The two further agree that left-wing objections to inherited wealth are misguided, but when Rubin says that the government doesn't do anything right, Joe Rogan reaches the point where he can't go along with Rubin's increasingly absurd assertions. Rubin: do they do the post office well? No. What do they do well? Rogan: they do the post office pretty good, actually. Rubin: but guess what? If the post office closed tomorrow, it would be all right. You'd still get mail. Amazon would... Rogan, dryly: it would suck. Rubin: no, it wouldn't. Amazon would pick... Rogan: you'd have to send things through UPS. It would cost a lot more. Rubin: it wouldn't, though. Competition would start kicking in, and between UPS, FedEx, and Amazon, and drones, and blah, blah, blah. Rogan doesn't even make the obvious points about how much Amazon currently relies on the post office, or how it would be massively unprofitable for private companies to service depopulated rural areas in a post-USPS world without enormously jacking up prices. All excellent reasons to think that it would indeed suck a great deal. But I have a hard time imagining that anyone watching that exchange or listening to it later could have missed the way that Rogan is bringing up practical realities, while Rubin is both literally and figuratively hand-waving it all away. It gets even funnier when Rubin tries to back up his childlike belief in the invisible hand by telling a story about ordering live chickens from UPS. Rogan points out that Rubin's story is actually a USPS success story. UPS doesn't deliver live chickens. Flustered, Rubin concedes that his story was about the USPS, but insists that in a libertarian utopia, UPS would deliver live chickens, and that they'd do it even better. He then awkwardly pivots from the Postal Service to regulation. Rubin: I'm not saying these things have to be eliminated tomorrow. I'm not even really calling for them to be eliminated. But just generally, what problem would you... Everything you're building here right now, do you want the government to tell you how to do all these things and all the regulations that you got to have your electric wire like this and... Rogan, slowly: regulations like that for construction are important, though. You got to make sure that people don't do stupid shit, that you don't have power lines near a water line, and that... Rubin: but I would put most of that on builders, though. They want to build things that are good. Rogan, after making incredulous noises: that's not true. People cut corners all the time. You have to have regulation when it comes to construction methods, or people are going to get fucked. Rubin: they cut corners when there are regulations anyway. Rogan, patiently: they do. But they would do a lot more if there weren't regulations. You go to third world countries and look at the construction methods. They're fucking dangerous. That's why schools collapse on kids. At this point, Rubin backs off again, retreating to an even vaguer version of some undefined libertarian claim about regulation, a claim that he says he likes intellectually, whatever that means. I strongly suspect that it's his way of acknowledging that it's impractical bullshit. Rubin will appear from time to time in this book either as an illustration of the bankruptcy of some of the IDW's ideas or as comic relief. But we shouldn't get too fixated on him. In this case, to be fair to Rubin, he's making exactly the same argument that Milton Friedman made for decades. In both the smart and dumb, Rubin, versions, the claims are equally untenable. This is also a good illustration of why, if we're going to, as the IDW people obsessively say but seldom do, steelman our opponents' arguments. I will spend less time focusing on Rubin and his various antics than the comedic part of me, and probably many of you so desperately want me to do. But don't worry, there will be some of that. The centrality of Rubin to the IDW's project undermines its claims to analytic rigor and a culture of intellectual introspection, which is probably why the IDW-aligned website Quillette has spent so much time lately isolating Rubin and his silly show. Rubin has taken this about as well as you'd think. It would be easy to spend the book mocking the idiocy of people like Dave Rubin, which admittedly is a core brand proposition for me, and ripping into the hypocrisy of guys like Jordan Peterson, who talk as if they're being persecuted by the all-powerful, intolerant left, while they hold down a tenured position at a prestigious university, Peterson, host a super-popular podcast, Harris, write a best-selling books, Peterson, Harris, Shapiro, and receive loving profiles in mainstream media outlets, all of them. And don't get me wrong, I will do some of that, but I'm primarily interested in a broader and more important project. For one thing, I want to understand not just what the IDW has in common with previous groups of reactionaries, but what's new and different about it, since even after the intellectual dark web withers away, the new right will continue in the same vein. It will, for instance, continue to hide its conservatism. That Harris is an atheist with some socially liberal domestic policy positions, that Rubin is a married gay man, that even Jordan Peterson never quite calls himself a conservative, all of this helps them brand themselves as unclassifiable renegades, even as they share elements of an unmistakable anti-left agenda. They all defend the capitalist economic order domestically and American imperial hegemony globally. They all see themselves as defenders of a poorly understood and, frankly, historically illiterate construct called the West. They all defend what they imagine to be biology against feminists, and at least some of them, like Sam Harris, who supported the odiously far-right and overly bigoted Charles Murray, defend a similar stance when it comes to race. Crucially, in all of these areas, the IDW promotes narratives that either naturalize or mythologize historically contingent power relations between workers and bosses, between men and women. They are old-school reactionaries. But how is the IDW different than what came before? That's a bit more complicated, a bit more difficult to explain. I think that the primary difference isn't to be found in the IDW itself, but in the larger context, the historical moment that they arose within. To understand the IDW moment, we should look back to April 1917, when Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from his exile in Switzerland. The train station at which he arrived has long been a symbol of the revolution he went on to lead, but 100 years later, in his contribution to a series of articles the New York Times published to mark the anniversary of that revolution, Jacobin editor Bhaskar Sinkara contrasted the political possibility that continues to be represented by St. Petersburg's Finland station with two contemporary metaphorical alternatives. Singapore station is the unacknowledged destination of the neoliberal center's train. It's a place where people in all their creeds and colors are respected, so long as they know their place. After all, people are crass and irrational, and capable of governing. Leave running Singapore station to the experts. Budapest station, named after the powerful right-wing parties that dominate Hungary today, is the final stop for the populist right. Budapest allows us to at least feel like we're back in charge. We get there by decoupling some of the cars hurtling us forward and slowly reversing. We're all in this together, unless you're an outsider who doesn't have a ticket, and then, tough luck. Sankara is no uncritical apologist for everything that happened in the years after Lenin arrived at the Finland station. In his article, he emphasizes, quote, political pluralism, dissent, and diversity as integral parts of his socialist project. He's dead right, though, that the pressing threats to democracy in today's world come from the, quote, decidedly non-Stalinist forms of authoritarianism represented by Singapore and Budapest stations. Like Bhaskar, I believe in Finland station. I'm also aware that much of the world today does often seem to be pitted between Budapest and Singapore. The 2016 presidential election in the United States, the struggles within Britain's political elites over Brexit, and the corporate media faith in modern centrist leaders like Emmanuel Macron all manifest a struggle between these two options. That said, if we see them as irreconcilably opposed, we'll miss important parts of the larger picture. Go back in the archive and look at Tony Blair's Home Secretary David Blunkett's comments on migrants to see that the themes of today's rightists did not emerge in a magical vacuum. Even if representatives of Budapest sometimes express dissatisfaction with market fundamentalism, the two have more in common than simplistic media narratives reveal. Look no further than the relationship between the woke Justin Trudeau government in Canada and the decidedly unwoke government of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro. In particular, these two agendas have found ways to not only coexist, but cross-pollinate in emergent forms of right-wing politics, particularly in new and social media. It's with this context in mind that I'll be exploring the IDW. I'll treat them as a case study in the way that reactionaries have begun to repackage their project of defending traditional hierarchies, even as I try to show what a rejuvenated, humane, internationalist, and appealing version of the politics of the Finland station might look like. Along the way, I'll show exactly what's wrong with the IDW's arguments, largely ignoring the always easy to dunk on dummy Dave Rubin and/or the bland Weinstein brothers. I'll take aim at the misleading narratives of Shapiro, Harris, and Peterson. Where they naturalize or mythologize social problems, I am going to historicize them. I'll critique the inadequate ways that the left has responded to the IDW's challenge and the broader evolution of right-wing ideology that its members represent. Though I firmly reject false equivalencies between well-intentioned but misguided leftists and actively malevolent reactionaries, I don't ignore the way that counterproductive strategies and inadequate analyses have played into the enemy's hands. Finally, I'll sketch out a left-wing vision that might help us meet the challenges presented by the new right by providing those who currently listen to Harris, Peterson, and Shapiro with a better way of understanding the world. Saying that culture war skirmishes have the effect of distracting us from the economic forces that lie at the root of our problems is true enough, but it's also not enough. The mistakes, excesses, and wrongs of the performatively ultra-woke can't be combated with economic analysis alone. Culture matters. In Marxist terminology, the ideological and cultural superstructure rests on a material base, but that doesn't mean that the latter issues don't have a life and an impact of their own, or that we're going to win power by telling people to simply ignore the cultural issues that profoundly impact their lives. What we need to transcend the stale dichotomies of the past is a cosmopolitan vision of global socialist humanism. In writing this book, I took particular inspiration from the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who, in response to the usual Eurocentric claim that the tradition that produced human rights flowed from Greece through Rome through Europe to America, countered that rather than a story of cultural continuity, the struggle for human dignity has always been fragmented, multicultural, and global. The West's history is hardly an unbroken chain of progress towards social equality. Instead of inaccurately particularizing the concepts of rights and justice as Western, we should understand that the fight for social equality and justice has arisen in various forms in a variety of cultures from ancient to modern times. While Jordan Peterson talks about, quote, the West as having discovered individual rights in a way that's so ahistorical that to listen to him you'd think that the UN Declaration of Human Rights was extracted from a speech Achilles gave at the end of the Iliad, the cynical promoters of, quote, Asian values are the other side of the same coin. Putting a minus where the Petersons of the world put a plus, leaders in Singapore and Malaysia have argued that their disregard for individual liberal protections that any socialist must defend, of assembly and free speech and dissent, is grounded in Confucian group norms. Sen elegantly and amply demonstrates that there are Asian, African, and Islamic arguments for open societies and free debate. Both the European chauvinist narrow and bigoted claim that, quote, West is the best, and the despotic case for, quote, Asian values should be rejected, not because of some moralistic taboo, but because the historical narrative underlying both arguments is a patchwork of nonsense. Similarly, we should reject both the Shapiro-Peterson defense of traditional hierarchies and the misguided attempts of the ultra-woke to improve society by scolding people for holding imperfect ideas in their heads or for having senses of humor. Wittingly or unwittingly, ultra-woke scolds feed a project of endless fragmentation and standpoint epistemology that, if relied on as a strategy for action, destroys any possibility for collective liberatory endeavor. At the same time, we need a path forward that rejects empirically baseless racial essentialism while avoiding the descent into tone-deaf economic reductionism. This is the only way we will move toward an equitable, compassionate, and truly global socialist future. The following framework and synthesis, which borrows from Marx, Fatima Mernissi, Cornel West, Adolph Reed, Bill Fletcher Jr., Mirza Baradaran, and many others, begins by grounding the critique of the IDW, the right, and capitalism in material conditions, as understanding these realities is essential to the success of any left project. It then elucidates a liberatory and internationalist project that has broad cultural appeal and is rooted in an ethos of openness and dynamism, not puritanical moralism. The Cape Verdean theorist and revolutionary Amilcar Cabral noted that imperialism and colonialism pushed its subjects outside of history, and that the purpose of anti-colonialism was to return the history-making process to colonized peoples. This book is best understood as an act of historicizing that integrates an international socialist project to both counter the right's fixation on pop science, hierarchy, and mythology, and, ultimately, to build a better world. However, only a bit more than a year into this joint project, there are already significant fissures inside this aggrieved band of renegades. Two leading lights of the IDW, along with Ben Shapiro and the Weinstein brothers, have left their mark on pop intellectual culture in the United States and Europe. The way they combined and repackaged the agendas of Budapest and Singapore isn't going anywhere. The group's devotion to affirming capitalism when its legitimacy is under threat, its shared obsession with campus and social media controversies, as we'll see, they manage to get such controversies wrong even when they're right, and their intense interest in IQ and other innate justifications for systemic inequalities is the defining feature of the right-wing project historically and in our specific moment. Chapter 2. The history is completely irrelevant. I've said that the intellectual dark web's favorite move is to naturalize or mythologize historically contingent power structures. How this works is pretty obvious in the case of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?